Hello, it's wonderful to see everybody here and a very warm welcome to this launch of our online exhibition on Walter Scott and Song, which is part of our celebrations to mark the 250th anniversary of Scott's birth. And thank you so much for coming along, and it's so lovely to see so many, many familiar faces. I can't see you, but you know what I mean. So some of you, I'm sure, know that the University of Aberdeen has long-standing associations with Walter Scott. The Walter Scott Research Centre, which I direct along with Professor David Hewitt, who will be speaking to you later, was established about 30 years ago.
Sorry, Ali, I think your sound might have gone there.
Well, let's start again.
No, you know what? It was only from the second slide there, Ali. So I think if you go back one, you'll be fine.
Right. Okay, so I was just saying that the centre was established about 30 years ago, the Walter Scott Research Centre, to support the editing of a scholarly edition of Walter Scott's fiction under David's leadership, which was completed in 30 volumes in 2012. And now, Gluttons for Punishment, we're editing an edition of Scott's poetry, and 2 volumes of that have been published so far. Marmion, edited by Ainsley McIntosh, and the shorter poems edited by P.D. Garside and Gillian Hughes. The edition as a whole will be published in 10 volumes by Edinburgh University Press. And I'm delighted to say that we've recently secured funding to edit the next 5 volumes, as well as to develop some teaching resources for schools based on Scott's poetry. Over the 30 years since the centre was established, though, our connections to Scots studies have expanded and grown. At the opening of the century, we were lucky enough to acquire the Bernard C. Lloyd collection of Scott materials, which is one of the best collections of Scott printed material anywhere in the world. And items from this exhibition feature in our exhibition, and Jane's going to be telling you more about this collection more generally later. Since the formation of the Abbotsford Trust in 2007, Aberdeen has also strengthened its connection with Abbotsford, Scott's wonderful home in the Scottish borders. I'm fortunate to be a trustee at Abbotsford, as well as honorary librarian. And with Abbotsford, the University of Aberdeen runs an open, free online course, Walter Scott, the Man Behind the Monument, which is facilitated by myself and Kirsty Archer-Thompson from Abbotsford. So I'm delighted that we've also been able to include some items from Abbotsford in the collection, in the exhibition. And if anybody's interested in that course and wants to find out more about Scott, it'll be running again from the 6th of September. And as I say, it's free. So all these connections have fed into this exhibition. We began planning for Scott 250 several years ago now, and when we began thinking about the particular ways in which Aberdeen could contribute, there were several things that we wanted to consider. Firstly, it was, we felt, important to showcase the very rich materials in the Lloyd collection. Secondly, we hoped that we could connect whatever we did to our own research in some way. And thirdly, I wanted to align whatever we did at Aberdeen with Abbotsford's wider aspirations for Scott 250, which involve making people think about Scott in new and innovative ways, and also to challenge some of the often repeated stereotypes and preconceptions about Scott. The media seem intent on reminding us that Scott's reputation fell into something of a decline in the 20th century. If I could have £1 for every time somebody said, nobody reads Scott anymore, do they? I'd be quite rich by this point. And it's certainly true that Scott is not nearly as widely read as he was in the 19th century. However, he was starting from a very high position. Such was Scott's popularity during his own lifetime that he commanded unprecedented sums of money as advances for his work. His poem, The Lady of the Lake, for example, that's his 3rd long narrative poem, sold over 20,000 copies in the first year. And his novel Rob Roy, one of the most famous, one that you might have heard of, sold 12,000 copies in 2 weeks. There were also numerous editions of his work in his own lifetime. No sooner had they printed one edition than they were printing the second edition and the third. And we have all of these editions in the Lloyd collection, along with other things. There were also many adaptations of his work into dramas, operas, and cheap chapbook publications. His fame was also worldwide. We've now had over 6,000 learners on our free online course. In fact, 6,100 at the last count. And they come from 117 different countries. And at one point, we asked those learners to look for evidence of Scott's legacy in their own environment, and then pin them onto an interactive map. And those learners are always amazed to find statues of Scott in their neighbourhood, as well as street names, parks and buildings, which are named after his novels and characters. So Scott's legacy is global and far-reaching. But at Aberdeen, I think I really want to emphasise that we don't work on Scott just because he was once a famous novelist and poet, but because we think he's an author that remains relevant. And I'm sure both David and myself would say we wouldn't have devoted so much of our life to thinking about Scott if we didn't think that Scott's a writer who still has much to say to our own times. Scott deals with the processes of history and how they operate. He asks questions about how the dynamics by which societies progress affect the ordinary people who are caught up in these pivotal moments. He's particularly concerned with how those often considered to be at the edges of society, women or beggars, the Roma people, serfs or outcasts, how they fit into the structures by which these societies operate. He also probes the dangers of religious and political extremism. And all of these questions remain relevant for us today. It's been our aim at Aberdeen at the Walter Scott Research Centre to emphasise this. First of all, by providing accurate versions of his work through our critical editions that support contemporary readers to engage with that work, but also through our teaching of Scott and through the critical activity undertaken by staff members at the centre. Crucially, and very importantly for me, that work is carried on by the many wonderful students, and particularly doctoral students attached to the centre, both past and present. Scott 250 then offers the opportunity for a further reawakening of Scott. Did we slip one on there? Yes, Scott 250 offers the opportunity for a further reawakening. The exhibition we're launching tonight is not the only way in which we're marking this anniversary at Aberdeen. We hope to hold events related to this exhibition later in the year. And in November, we're also going to be launching an exhibition about Scott's chapbook and popular print collections in collaboration with Abbotsford. Scott owns around 3,000 items of popular print, and I think that reshapes our understanding of Scott in many ways. So we'll be having an exhibition about that later in the year. We're also developing projects around Scott's love of walking and its relationship to mental health. One of the key themes for Scott 250 is well-being. The first of these projects has been developed by one of our postgraduate students, Catherine Ferrier, and it provides the opportunity to undertake a Scott walk starting at Braemar in May next year, where you can have the opportunity to go on what's quite a lengthy walk, I should say, and reflect on Scott's understanding of the relationship between walking and mental health. So I would urge you to have a look at our website and see if you want to sign up to that. But we also hope to be doing something more locally on the campus in the spring. So you can find out about all of these initiatives on the Walter Scott Research Centre webpage, which is easy enough to find, and also at Abbotsford's excellent 250 website. So that's walterscott250.com. which tells you about all the events, not only at Abbotsford, but taking place across Scotland and beyond, as part of a Scott 250 national partnership hosted by Abbotsford and involving now well over 60 organisations. And I think if you have a look at that, maybe that's how you found this event, but if you go back and have a look, it keeps evolving with new events. And what's really interesting is to see all the innovative ways in which people are celebrating Scott, and by implication, all the ways in which Scott's life and work actually lends itself to these approaches. I'm delighted, though, that we are kicking off Aberdeen celebrations with this exhibition. But why Scott and Song? And how will this hopefully contribute to the process of recalibrating Scott, or retuning him, to borrow the phrase taken from the title of the exhibition, which itself echoes a concept from Scott himself, articulated at the opening of The Lady of the Lake. Some of you may have spotted that. Harp of the North, that mouldering long hast flung on the witch elm that shanes had fill in spring, and down the fitful breeze thy numbers flung, till envious ivy did around thee cling, muffling with verdant ringlet every string. O minstrel harp, still must thine accents sleep, mid rustling leaves and fountains murmuring, still must thy sweeter sounds their silence keep, nor bid a warrior smile, nor teach a maid to weep. O wake once more, how rude soe'er the hand that ventures o'er thy magic maze to stray. O wake once more, though scarce my still command some feeble echoing of thine earlier lay. Though harsh and faint and soon to die away, and all unworthy of thy nobler strain, yet if one heart throb higher at its sway, the wizard note has not been touched in vain. Then silent be no more, enchantress, wake again. So Scott, a nod to his own activities as minstrel, but also announcing that he's reawakening the spirit of Scottish poetry and minstrelsy, and we hope we're reawakening that spirit too, to some extent. Now, Scott himself writes, I do not know and cannot utter a note of music, and complicated harmonies seem to me a babble of confused though pleasing sounds. So this exhibition might seem something of an odd choice. But I think Scott is being falsely modest here, as he so often is. And as this exhibition aims to show, an association with music and song, in fact, runs throughout Scott's career. I think many people do actually have a vague sense that Scott is connected to the song and musical tradition in some kind of way. But as so often with Scott, part of what this exhibition will do, I hope, is to remind you that in spite of the often repeated mantra that no one reads Scott, or that Scott is no longer relevant, you do actually know something about Scott, because he is in fact such a large part in our cultural currency that he can be found all around us. You may recall, for example, that Scott began his career collecting ballads, those storytelling songs from the oral tradition. Scott published these as Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border in 1802. But you might not know, those of you who have an Aberdeen connection, that Scott's collection has connections very close to home. Anna Gordon, otherwise known as Mrs. Brown of Falkland, was one of the people who supplied Scott with ballads for minstrelsy. Her father was a professor at the University of Aberdeen, and she was brought up in Humanity Manse, the building that now, of course, houses the Research Institute of Irish and Scottish Studies, in which some of you will remember seminars very happily spent in that building. So you can find out more about her in the exhibition, and in an event on the 25th of October, when Sigrid Rieverts and Sally Garden of the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border project at the University of Mainz will be running an event to go along with this exhibition. But Scott's connections with song go beyond the ballad tradition. Scott's popularity as a poet and novelist meant that his work was adapted into many forms and genres, and adaptations are a strong element in our Lloyd collection. For example, 93 operas are based on Scott's work, more than any other writer apart from Shakespeare. Indeed, Scott notes in his journal that he's seen an operatic version of Ivanhoe in Paris, and I'm going to quote because I find it quite amusing. So they're in the evening at the Odeon in Paris, where we saw Ivanhoe. It was superbly got up, the Norman soldiers wearing pointed helmets and what resembled much hauberks of mail, which looked very well. The number of the attendants and the skill with which they are moved and grouped on the stage is well worthy of notice. It was an opera, and of course the story greatly mangled and the dialogue in a great part nonsense. Yet it was strange to hear anything like the words which I, then in an agony of pain with spasms in my stomach, dictated to William Laidlaw at Abbotsford, now recited in a foreign tongue and for the amusement of a strange people. I little thought to have survived the completing of this novel. Poor Scott was suffering from gallstones when he wrote Ivanhoe and in great pain, so he didn't think he would survive that, but there he was in Paris watching an opera of it, and quite amused to find it performed there. He would, I think, have been even more flabbergasted to find that some of these operas are still performed today, and you can find out about these and their relationship to Scott's work in the opera section of the exhibition, and also about an innovative project to bring one of the most famous of these, Lucia de Lammermoor, back to Scotland, thanks to our friends at the Teatro di San Carlo in Naples. And David's going to be saying a lot more about that later. There were also numerous stage adaptations of Scott's work, just dramatic adaptations. While the relationship between these and song may not be immediately apparent, the staging Scott part of the exhibition explains just why people keep bursting into song in these dramas. Rob Roy was the most famous of these dramatisations, and it was the one that was performed when George IV came to Edinburgh in 1822, and Scott, of course, coordinated the celebrations for George's visit, and Rob Roy was performed at the Theatre Royal. But it was also performed more recently in 1962 when the King and Queen of Norway came to Edinburgh, so it had quite longevity. As you'll discover in the exhibition, it was also the basis for one of Aberdeen's very own student shows. And of course, we also had an exhibition on the student shows, which Special Collections has set up, so these go very nicely together. What might come as slightly more of a surprise to some of you is that Scott was also a songwriter himself. At the time when Scott was at the height of his fame, collectors such as George Thomson and Alexander Campbell were collecting traditional songs and airs from Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and were commissioning new words for traditional arrangements of them by some of the finest composers of the day, such as Beethoven and Haydn. Burns, and I think more people perhaps know this, supplied George Thomson with material, but so too did Scott. Thomson sent Scott airs and Scott wrote the words to fit the tunes, and you can find out more about the songs he wrote in the exhibition. This section of the exhibition, perhaps more than any other, draws most immediately on the work we're undertaking for our new edition of Scott's poetry. One of the volumes we have published that you can see here is the shorter poems, edited, as I said, by P.D. Garside and Gillian Hughes. And that volume contained the words to many of the songs that Scott wrote. Indeed, I think we were all a little bit surprised when editing that volume to discover that around 30 of the 134 items in it were actually words which Scott wrote specifically as songs. Songs, too, were frequently derived from his novels and longer poems. As I mentioned earlier, we've already completed a scholarly edition of Scott's fiction, and it's the source for some of the material that made its way into the song repertoire. His longer poems, which we're also currently editing, are also the source of song material. The Lady of the Lake was published in 1810, and it was probably the poem that above all prompted people to come to Scotland when a wave of tourists came to visit the scenes around Loch Katrine that it described. It also prompted many artists, such as Turner, to paint the scenes described in the poem. But perhaps what is less well known is that it's the source of song material, some of which you will undoubtedly recognise. For example, Ave Maria is derived from it. You might also ponder on the connection between the poem and the American presidential inauguration. So find out when you tune in. Songs derived from Scott's writing were in fact being sung both in domestic and public settings in the 19th and 20th centuries. We touch on this in the exhibition. We have family songbooks belonging to both Scott's own family, and thanks to the generosity of Dr. Bill Sachs, Jane Austen's family, where we can see Jane Austen and her sister and her niece writing out the songs that they liked to sing and play, and those include songs derived from Scott. We can't show you everything from the Lloyd collection relating to song in this exhibition, and some of the things we've had to leave out are the many song sheets that we have in this special collections that show the ways in which the tradition of singing Scott was both widespread and long-lasting. One of my personal favourites is the New England Pocket Songster, which was published in New Hampshire in 1846. It contains songs derived from Scott's drama The House of Aspen, as well as from more familiar poems such as The Lord of the Isles, The Lady of the Lake and Rugby. And I really like to think of a Scot making their way to New Hampshire, where actually many of my family now live, having moved there from Scotland, carrying a bit of home around with them in the form of a pocket Scott. So Scott in their pocket and songs in their pocket from Walter Scott. And of course, it's things like that that explain all those statues and street names and buildings derived from Scott in places like America, where Scott's reach was partly through not only the novels and poems themselves, but through these adaptations. So overall, we'll hope that you'll discover from this exhibition that Scott contributed to the tradition of song in many ways, whether it's in the form of ballads, adaptations, original songs, or songs derived from his work. Scott is in fact everywhere. As so often, as I said, when you engage with Scott, you discover that you know more about him than you realised, and that you've crossed paths with him without knowing it. And Scott is still part of a living tradition of song singing. Both the ballads he collected and the songs he wrote informed the folk revival of the 1960s, and they're still very much part of the folk repertoire. For that reason, one of the things that I'm most pleased about in this exhibition is the fact that it contains so much music, both in the form of pre-existing recordings of Scott and in new material recorded by our students, by the wonderful Sally Garden, an Aberdeen alumna, and through our Elphinstone Institute connections from our friends in the Polish-Scottish Song Group. There are even opportunities for you to sing along. Emma's provided the words. Please do this. Songs are for singing after all, as James Hogg's mother pointed out to Scott while he was collecting ballads. Well, of course, COVID has made mounting this exhibition challenging. It's allowed us to include music in a way that might not have been entirely possible in the library had the exhibition been staged in the usual way. I suppose it's a silver lining and one of the aspects of the exhibition that I hope you'll most enjoy. I hope too that this exhibition, along with the other activities this year, will challenge some preconceptions about Scott, as well as telling you more about Scott and song. Too often, Scott's remembered as some kind of posh bloke who has no relevance today. Scott actually wasn't that posh. He built his house at Abbotsford with money earned from his work, and hard earned at that, and he became a Sar as a consequence of his services to literature, among other things. This exhibition reminds us that he began his career collecting the songs and stories passed down by ordinary people and preserving them for the future. The many adaptations of his work, both during his own lifetime and now, in a living tradition of song, remind us that his work continues to strike a chord, if you'll excuse the pun, with ordinary people. Today, Scott is also often credited with creating a simple and romantic image of Scotland, and perhaps one that's no longer considered relevant. But I hope that this exhibition and the richness of the adaptations derived from Scott will encourage you to think that Scott's engagement with nationhood and the past may be more complex than you realised. And I hope too that by engaging with the ways in which Scott collected, wrote and inspired song, you'll be tempted to go back and read or reread some of his writing. If you do so, I think you'll find a poet and novelist far more entertaining and relevant for today than you realised. In a moment, you're going to hear some of the music from the exhibition, and I'll then hand over to Jane, who'll tell you more about the Lloyd collection. But before I do that, though, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank a couple of people who've helped. My colleagues in the Walter Scott Research Centre have been huge help and support, in particular David Hewitt and Jonathan Hicks. As I mentioned earlier, we're immensely grateful to those people who've given us permission to use recordings and who've recorded material, especially for the exhibition. Other institutions have lent images and expertise, including the Abbotsford Trust, the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust, the Minstrelsy Project at Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz, and Dr. Bill Zacks. Michelle Gate and their staff in the reading room have helped scan material, sometimes on rather vague instructions, because we couldn't actually get in there to look at it ourselves. Above all, Jenny Down, Susan Curran and Emma Raymond have helped put this together, this exhibition. Emma, you've done a brilliant job and it's been a joy to work with you. Sorry if I've missed anybody, but please accept my thanks. Working in Scott for over 30 years has taught me one thing above all. Scott always has the capacity to surprise us. You think you know everything and then something else pops up. I'm sure this anniversary year is going to be full of surprises and opportunities for people to discover Scott or to rediscover him in new ways. And I hope the exhibition contributes to that in some small way, but most of all, I hope you enjoy it. So without more ado, let's hear one of the songs featured in the exhibition, Jock of Hazeldean, written by Scott and sung here by the Polish-Scottish Song Group. And I believe they chose it partly because it's one of the few traditional songs to have a happy ending.
While weep ye by the tide, lady, while weep ye by the tide, I'll wed you to my youngest son, and ye shall be his bride, and ye shall be his bride, lady, say calmly to be seen. But I she let the tears soon fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. Now let his wilful grief be done, and dry that cheek sae pale. Young Frank is chief o' Warrington, and Lord o' Langlydale. His step is first in peaceful awe, his sword in battle keen. But I she let the tears soon fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. Our chain o' goud ye shall nae lack, nor braid to bind your hair, nor mettled hound, nor managed hawk, nor palfrey fresh and fair. And ye the foremost of them all shall ride o'er forest green. But I she let the tears soon fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. The kirk was decked at morning tide, the taper glimmered fair. The priest and bridegroom waked the bride, and dame and knight were there. They socked her baith by bar and taw, the lady wordless seen. She's o'er the border and awa, wi' Jock o' Hazeldean. She's are the border and Tawa, which of O hazel deep.
Thank you. I'm now going to pass over to Jane Perry, who's going to tell you more about the Lloyd collection.
Hello, right, that's a tough act to follow. This is just a very brief overview of the Bernard C. Lloyd Walter Scott collection, which is housed in the Department of Museums and Special Collections in the Sir Duncan Library. And the majority of the material that you see in the online exhibition comes from this collection. The collection consists of over 6,000 items devoted to Walter Scott. It contains first editions of nearly all Scott's novels, poems, essays, and other works published during his lifetime, and subsequent editions, as well as books, manuscripts, music, ephemera, all inspired by or relating to Scott. It was collected and curated by businessman Bernard Lloyd from 1972 onwards and was acquired by the university in 2002 with assistance from the Heritage Lottery Fund. My first encounter with this collection came just under 20 years ago when I was tasked with unpacking the collection and checking it off against the Lloyd catalogue, the cover of which you see here. This wasn't an arduous task, and in fact it turned out to be an absolute joy, both because of the material involved and because of the catalogue. Bernard Lloyd has made donations to the collection over the years, and additional purchases have also been made by the Department of Special Collections with the assistance of other bodies. The department classified the collection initially following the sections and identifiers of Lloyd's catalogue, which is shown here, his contents page. And so the original catalogue is still a very useful and relevant guide to the collection. Our records at the time were catalogued in quite a limited university system, and so they tend to be quite brief. But Bernard Lloyd's entries were rich in detail, not only containing a physical description of the items and their condition, but also noting their significance and their place in the world of Scott public. For instance, here is the entry for WSM 95, which is a letter to the editor of the Edinburgh Weekly Journal from Malachi Malagrowther, Esquire, Scott, on the proposed change of currency. Now, the fascinating part for me comes after the bibliographic details, and I've highlighted it here in blue. When the government decided to reform the banking system and restrict the issue of notes to the Bank of England, a move which would have restricted trade as well as being in violation of the Act of Union, Scott fought vigorously for Scotland with 3 pamphlets which roused opposition to the move and resulted in Scotland being excluded from the reform. As a result of this, Scottish banks still issue their own notes to this day. And I think that's why as well that Walter Scott's on your £10 note. So, but here, not only is there a thorough description of what M95 is, but also an explanation of why this pamphlet is of importance. And this is repeated in other entries throughout the catalogue. So by the time I'd finished unpacking all the boxes and ordering the books on the shelf, I had a pretty good idea of what the collection contained, but also I'd increased considerably my knowledge of the work and life of Walter Scott. What struck me then, and still strikes me, are 2 things. Just how prolific a writer Scott was, not just of novels and poetry, but the works he contributed to and edited as well. And the second thing was the sheer popularity of Scott, and the fact that this popularity was almost immediate, exemplified in the plays and playbills and chapbooks that are found in the collection. So I'm just going to show you some examples from this vast range of material. So starting with Waverley. This is the first edition of Waverley in the 3 volumes with plain blue boards and publishers' labels, as it would have been issued in 1814. Of course, if you want to read Scott Waverley today, it's far easier to read the paperback or an online edition. But I think there's something to be gained by looking at the original set, the three-decker novels, as this is how they would have been available to the book buyers of the early 19th century. And many of these purchasers would then have had the books bound according to their own taste or their budget. And so having a set in the original publisher's boards is quite rare and makes these all the more precious. In addition to every complete edition of the Waverley novels are derivatives as well, such as children's editions like this 1920 printing of Ivanhoe, with these lovely plates by the graphic artist and illustrator Maurice Greifenhagen. There are chapbooks. Chapbooks were often produced illegally in cheap formats, and with Scott, they were produced soon after his works were published. This edition of Peveril of the Peak appeared within a year of Scott's original. Again, these illustrate the popularity of Scott during his lifetime. The 3-volume editions were beyond the pocket of many, but a cheap print chapbook wasn't. In the collection, as Ali has said, there's dramatic adaptations of the work. They soon followed initial publication as well. The collection contains a great many playbills advertising these plays, and they advertise them throughout the country. And playbills are ephemeral and they're scarce, but they're priceless records which show Scott's popularity and performance throughout the 19th century. And of course, in the collection, the whole point of the exhibition is music. The depictions of Scott in song and opera, well represented. And this is one from the collection, the first edition, sorry, the exhibition, the first edition vocal score in Italian and German of Rossini's La Donna del Lago, the Lady of the Lake. And you can find out more about that in the exhibition. As I mentioned, Bernard Lloyd continued to add items to the collection, and one section which came a few years after the initial library was his collection of comic books relating to Walter Scott's writing. Now, Bernard Lloyd himself described these comics as an art of pure composition, arguing that they are a valid and important genre which introduced many younger readers. They also again show the broad and enduring popularity of Scott. Here we have a comic based on the MGM film of Quentin Durward, starring Robert Taylor, looking very dashing here, and a Dutch language edition of The Lady of the Lake. And to me, these show the strength of Scott's narrative. The wonderful adventurous plots can be translated from medium to medium and available in a variety of literary formats and in a wide range of languages. One of the major Scott acquisitions for the collection was made by Special Collections in 2005, which was a set of corrected proofs of the first edition of Red Gauntlet, and with amendments mostly in the hand of James Ballantyne, Scott's friend and his printer and publisher. The books also had a distinguished provenance coming from the library of Hugh Walpole. Now, this unique copy allowed research into the editing and revision of copy for print, and so the collection continues to evolve and grow, providing a valuable research resource. And I must apologise here, I've cheated. This is a picture from a later edition. I did have one of the proof copies. I'm going to finish this very, very brief outline of it. It's an immense collection. Do look online more about it, and you can request items from Special Collections once we open up fully again. So this is a Mauchline wooden box with photographers of Abbotsford, Melrose Abbey and so on transferred onto it. And you could regard this as maybe a minor souvenir piece. And whilst the collection contains some exceptionally rare individual books and manuscripts, it also contains what could be considered less prestigious objects like this. However, I think it's as a totality, as a whole, that the collection should be regarded and valued, because it does show the breadth and wealth of material which has been produced by and inspired by Walter Scott. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor David Hewitt, who is going to talk about Sir Walter Scott and opera.
Right. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
And can I be seen?
Yes, indeed.
Right. On Saturday last week, I was at a recital in the Edinburgh Festival in honour of Walter Scott. The first part of the tribute to him was in the quality of the performers, singing songs by Haydn and Beethoven for which Scott supplied words, and also by a range of 19th century composers, Raff, Mendelssohn, Glinka, Meyerbeer, Parry, Ada and Schubert, all of whom had responded to Scott. That programme really could go along with our exhibition, illustrating just how much inspiration Scott provided for his successors. And if anybody wants to hear it, you can get it free online by going to the Edinburgh Festival at homepage. But this evening, I want to talk not about music inspired by Scott, but about the stage derivatives. In 1992, a chap called Philip Bolton published a book called Scott Dramatised, in which he lists 4,500 productions, including operas, derived from Scott's works. It's an extraordinary number. The two most popular, by far, were Daniel Terry's Guy Mannering, or The Gypsy's Prophecy, first performed in Covent Garden on the 12th of March, 1816. And Isaac Pocock's Rob Roy MacGregor, or Auld Lang Syne, first performed in Covent Garden on the 12th of March 1880. There were 860 separate productions of Guy Mannering and 970 of Rob Roy, mainly in the 19th century. However, they were not advertised as plays. You might have noticed that in the bill, the theatre bill for Rob Roy. Guy Mannering was billed and published as a musical play, with music by Henry Bishop, Thomas Atwood, and John Davy. In addition to that music, specially written for the shows, there were many inset songs. Bolton says of Guy Mannering, several hundred different songs circulated through 800 productions and the many thousands of performances. The playbill for the first production in Covent Garden says that books of songs can be had in the theatre, priced 10pence. One can see why the Times review of the first production called it first a musical drama and later an opera. In the course of the next year, it was staged in Durham, Beverley, Scarborough, Nottingham, York, Macclesfield, Newcastle again, Dublin, Covent Garden, for the second time, South Shields, Bath, Reading, Edinburgh, Portsmouth, and Boston and Lincolnshire. The list continues unabated into the following years. In fact, the work was staged so often that it must have risked becoming stale and hackneyed. And one of the ways of freshening up was to incorporate new songs while retaining the staples, of which the echo duet from the opera The Americans by John Braham, by repute the greatest tenor of his day, was the most popular. Over the years, there was a marked increase in the number of traditional Scottish songs and songs by Burns. Perhaps it was the developing tendency to incorporate such materials that provided justification for the description national opera that both works were given in Scotland. One obvious advantage is that Northern audiences would already have known the tunes and at least the words of the choruses, and so would have been able to join in. But it also looks as though this trend to incorporate more traditional tunes was itself creating tradition. One illustration is about Scott's own Bluebonnets Over the Border, which starts to appear as a song within the play Guy Mannering in the mid-20s. Now, Bluebonnets Over the Borders was first published within the novel The Monastery in 1820, where Scott calls the tune An Ancient Air. Penny Fielding's note in her edition of the novel tells us that Scott's song was suggested by March, March, Pinks of Election, found with the early 18th century tune Leslie's March in James Hogg's The Jacobite Relics of Scotland, the first volume of which came out in 1819. In 1824, the tune was altered by R.A. Smith so as to fit Scott's words, and it became known as Bluebonnets Over the Border rather than Leslie's March. This, I might suggest, is undoubtedly tradition on the move. Adaptations normally claim an identity with the originating text by retaining the title, with the names of characters and so on, even when different. These two plays are different from the novels Guy Mannering and Rob Roy. In addition to the inset songs, the comic roles of Dominie Sampson and Baillie Nicol Jarvie are much expanded. Yet curiously, the resulting mélange achieves the cultural role that Scott conceived for his novels as explained in the last chapter of Waverley, the resurrection and preservation of the old Scotland. Of course, the memory of the past that is achieved by writing about it involves a simplification and a narrowing. No doubt Scott realized that the musical dramas derived from his novels involved a further simplification and narrowing, but he endorsed the process by assisting Daniel Terry. In the introduction to the 1820 edition of the script, we are told that, quote, Guy Mannering is a very near kinsman of the melodrama. Pathos, comedy, tragedy, musical incident are skillfully blended. And however rigid taste may condemn it, this sort of drama is infinitely more popular than any classical composition. This is confirmed by the extraordinary success of Guy Mannering and Rob Roy MacGregor. And to judge from the reviews, there is no doubt that these two plays were considered the peak of achievement in this mixed genre. The other kind of opera, what Scott's contemporaries called Italian opera, was a continental tradition. Some 93 operas are based on Scott's works. Those figures are those of Jerome Mitchell, and they are, of course, a bit wobbly, for it's not possible to define with precision what is or is not derived from Scott. Nonetheless, the number is astonishing, and they include Rossini's La Donna del Lago, Bellini's I Puritani, Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor and Il Castello de Kenilworth, Otto Nicolai's Il Templario, and Beattie's La Jolie Fille de Perth. Scott's long poems and novels, when going into Europe, translated into French, and into all the languages of Europe thereafter. Translation begins a process of transformation. The most significant translator into French was a man named de Faucompré, Auguste Jean-Baptiste de Faucompré. Paul Barnaby, the keeper of the course collection of Scott in the Edinburgh University Library, has shown how French translations of The Tale of Old Mortality and of Rob Roy reconfigured the novels for a Catholic, post-Napoleonic readership. In other words, they became significantly more conservative, both socially and politically. I don't think that any of us will know any operas based upon Old Mortality and Rob Roy, but I'm sure that Paul Barnaby's argument has general application. In other words, I'm arguing that the very act of translation begins a process of transformation. My own two examples will be operas that you may well know: La Donna del Lago by Rossini in 1819 and Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor in 1835, both written for the Teatro di San Carlo in Naples. The first translation of The Lady of the Lake into French by Elisabeth de Bon came in 1813. The title page tells us that La Dame du Lac is a roman tiré du poème de Walter Scott. In other words, it's a prose translation. Leone Tratella, who wrote the libretto for La Donna del Lago, almost certainly used this French version rather than Scott's original. Unlike Salvatore Camerano, who may have used the French translation of The Bride, but who certainly had Italian translations to work from. What is more, a footnote shows that he had also referred to Scott's own 1830 edition of The Bride of Lambermore. The second change, over and above translation, and it's a huge one, is the simplification of the plot. In The Bride, Scott took a simple story and developed it so that readers could see that the destruction of the lovers was due to political, social, and economic forces beyond their control. Camerano reverses the process, cutting Scott's historical analyses. He also reduced the number of characters. There are only 5 main parts in both operas, and none of the characters who expand the anthropological significance of The Lady of the Lake survives. The third change is the removal of the precise temporal and geographic locators. There are none in La Donna del Lago. Even the suggestion of Scotland is minor. A huntsman mentions Scottish women, Eleanor cites Fingal, but a Highlander becomes un alpino. In his preface, Totala expresses the hope that Scott would have understood that he had to simplify. Scott would have understood. But the story loses all the historical significance that it has in Scott. Scott's poem is set about 1540, and the King James V is in conflict with the Highland chief Roderick Dhu. The king's policy is to concentrate power in the monarchy while Roderick claims local autonomy. The political issue is reformulated in the love plot. The king wants Ellen as his mistress, Roderick wants Ellen as his wife, and then Ellen is eventually given to the nonentity Malcolm Graham. That simple summary constitutes the plot of the opera. However, Rossini lived in Naples from 1815 to 1822, and Totala spent his whole life there. Both must have been aware of the politics of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored following the defeat of Napoleon and the expulsion of its papal king Murat. It was highly repressive. It abolished Sicily's 1812 British Constitution. A concordat of the papacy in 1818 gave the church power to suppress books and journals. A secret police force was established to suppress dissent. The Bourbons were opposed by the Carbonari, a secret society composed of nobles, army officers, officials, priests, etc., who wished to establish a constitutional monarchy or a republic. It was considered by the government as a terrorist organization, if I may use more modern terminology. And it resulted in a general uprising. Their activities resulted in a general uprising in 1820, 1821, which was suppressed with the help of Austria. I wish to submit that La Donna del Lago is directly relevant to the politics of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Rodrigo and his clansmen articulate their opposition to James in song. No doubt the king, the government, and courtiers in the Teatro di San Carlo would not have felt threatened by La Donna del Lago. After all, it was a period piece set in a remote country. But the application must have been clear. I admit I have no evidence that anyone responded to La Donna in this way. I've not done the necessary research. But there are some clues, of which the most significant is that the choruses of the guerrillas and bardi were adopted by those who later fought for a unified Italy. One of the warriors' songs was sung by Garibaldi's soldiers as he entered Rome in 1849. In other words, by simplifying the plot, reducing the character count, eliminating the anthropological commentary within the action, and by removing all geographic, temporal, and cultural locators, Totila has made the story convertible, and the story became a vehicle for a political purpose far removed from anything that Scott had envisaged. I now wish to introduce a short film produced by the Teatro di San Carlo, which is reversing that story and tracing Lucia di Lammermoor back to its roots in Scotland. We're immensely pleased to be working with the Teatro di San Carlo and are very grateful for their permission to allow us to show this as part of our online exhibition, Walter Scott and Song. Thank you.
We were really excited when our lovely friends at St. Carlo Opera House in Naples got in touch with us and explained what they were trying to do with the documentary connected to their production of Lucia di Lammermoor. We had the 250th anniversary of Sir Walter Scott, and I think it's been a fantastic bridge partnership between our two establishments, and we were able to share with our friends there the approach that we would take to this wonderful piece.
I think Lucia's success is because in many ways it has all the right ingredients. It has a very strong story, it has wonderful music, it is a good experience in the theatre for the audience, and it's also a wonderful thing for people to take part in. I mean, the soprano and particularly, and also the tenor and the baritone have wonderful roles in the piece. So it has all the right ingredients, I think.
L'arte, la cultura, gli spettacoli comunque ci parlano ad un livello sicuramente esplicito, ma ci parlano anche ad un livello inconscio, di cose che in qualche modo ci colpiscono, ma noi non decifriamo nel momento in cui le vediamo, ci vuole un po' più di tempo, però ci rimangono dentro, al di là delle musiche di Donizetti che sono magnifiche, sono stupende, di tutta la coralità che c'è, tutte le scene del coro sono meravigliose.
If you can do Lucia in its original key, it becomes a much more exciting, dramatic piece, and not just for vocal display, which is, of course, an element of it and why we love it, but it's not the whole story. So I like the dramatic side of the piece, and also put in the Wolf's Crag scene, which is often omitted. That's also quite some of the most dramatic music in the piece.
Io credo che ci sia questa storia di enorme sofferenza, di violenza e di riscatto umano, perché poi alla fine Lucia era una che cercava la libertà di amare e riscatta la propria libertà tramite un gesto violento. Ho avuto la fortuna di crescere in un altro tempo, in un'altra epoca, in un altro ambiente, però io non mi sento di condannarla per questa cosa. Ci passa una linea sottile che è quella di capire, ecco, l'opera quando ti mette in contatto con un altro personaggio che fa delle azioni che tu non faresti mai, però in qualche modo il processo umano di empatia ti porta a cercare di capire quali sono state le ragioni. Allora non lo condividi, perché non lo condividi, però lo capisci. E questa cosa in qualche modo ti plasma a tua volta, ti cambia. Vivere la storia di Lucia, andare a teatro significa vivere una vita, e vivere quella vita e quelle esperienze ti permettono di trarre delle conclusioni, dei significati e di evolverti da questo punto di vista. Quello che cambia, quello che influisce è proprio la caratura che ha il personaggio e l'impatto che ha sulla storia e come avrebbe influenzato anche le generazioni più giovani, anche la mia generazione.
Gaetano Donizetti era giunto a Napoli nel marzo del 1822, dopo aver sposato la figlia di un magistrato romano, Virginia. La vita di Donizetti cambia radicalmente in città. Si trasferirono proprio in questo palazzo, in via Nardones 14 a Napoli, ma fu soltanto nel 1828 che poi Donizetti ebbe il suo primo incontro con la letteratura di Walter Scott.
Sometimes I'm told as a curator of Abbotsford that people don't read Scott anymore. And I come back with a challenge on that, because obviously it is my job and the work of the Abbotsford Trust to enthuse people about Scott and to get people to consider all of the things that are relevant and contemporarily interesting in his writing.
Why is 2021 so important to us here at Abbotsford and to Sir Walter Scott? Well, it's Sir Walter Scott's 250th birthday, and we thought it right to mark that occasion as best we can. He's such an important figure to Scotland, to literature, and to really the world of the arts. There's so very much that he did. He saved the Scottish banknote. He discovered the Scottish crown jewels. He's responsible for an enormous amount of the English language. In the Oxford English Dictionary, he's the second most quoted source in the English language after William Shakespeare.
So Scott first buys what would become Abbotsford in 1811 and relocates here with his family in 1812. So he spends the next 15 years adding bits on, knocking bits down, and creating wings of the house and rooms and interiors, all designed to showcase his collections, his interests, and of course offer him spaces for writing. So it takes him about 15 years to create the Abbotsford that you see today.
He has the second largest monument to any writer in the world. It used to be the largest, but now just the second largest. And he's the only writer in the world to have a railway station named after his works, which of course is Edinburgh Waverley, named after the Waverley novels. He was a prolific writer, and obviously there's an awful lot of history to work with. So from the point of view of needing your imagination, history does a lot of the hard work for you.
Sometimes the perception that Scott was writing about the past means that people think of him very much as having nothing to offer the present, or somehow being stuck in times gone by and wanting to go back to the days of old. But actually that's not what Scott's doing at all in any of his novels. He's very, very clever. What he's doing is trying to teach us lessons about the here and now, about his time, but also lessons for us and our times and our great debates, by showing us the lessons of history, showing us that nothing is really new. Things go round in circles, and all of the issues that humans face come back round again. And actually we can learn an awful lot about how to move into our future if we consider our past.
Lucia ha influenzato la sua generazione sicuramente, ma ha influenzato anche la nostra. Diventa inevitabilmente, inequivocabilmente uno dei pilastri sul quale la nostra società oggi si basa, è la nostra storia culturale.
Cammarano, napoletano, non deve essere sfuggito l'accenno ripetuto ben 4 volte nel testo di Walter Scott ad un luogo molto importante, la Fontana delle Sirene. In realtà il termine inglese usa la parola mermaid, un significato molto diverso da quello di sirena mediterranea. L'illusione dell'amore porterà alla catastrofe. Ecco, tutte queste evocazioni insieme al buio, alla nebbia, alla situazione che è tipica di una Scozia esotica per Napoli, il librettista la riesce a condensare perfettamente. La musica di Donizetti crea quell'alternanza appunto di buio e di luce. La luce qual è? La luce è nel nome di Lucia. La stessa evocazione dello sguardo, della luce che perderà con la follia finale.
Madness in opera is an interesting subject, and it has been in opera almost since the very beginning, because music is so powerful and can depict these scenes.
We are running a project called Sweet Sounds and Wild Places from the opera Lucia di Lammermoor by Donizetti to reach out to perhaps some groups within the community who've been particularly struggling over the last year or so in view of the pandemic.
The questions of mental fragility are something that lots of artists have been grappling with because they haven't been able to do what they do for such a long time. So it's timely, yeah.
One of the sort of driving forces of everything that we do is it's about encouraging people to use their experience of opera, the art form, and relate them in some way to aspects of their own lives.
Of fays that nightly dance upon the wold, and lovers doomed to wander and to weep, and castles high where wicked wizards keep their captive thralls.
I suppose the true power of music is to move us in some way, and that can be in all sorts of ways. It can move us spiritually, it can move us emotionally, but it should have some direct effect on our subconscious and on our being, because it's an expression of emotion. And that's our job. And it's also our pleasure when it works.
Thou sweetest thing that e'er did fix its lightly fired sprays to the rude rock, wouldst thou cling to me, rough and storm-worn I am, yet love me as thou truly dost, I will love thee again with true and honest heart, though all unmeet, to be the mate of such sweet gentleness.
Se non ci fosse stato Walter Scott avremmo perso questa storia, nessuno l'avrebbe raccontata di questa cosa che è veramente successa, e se non ci fosse stato Donizetti a incastonarla nella storia della musica magari si sarebbe perso il romanzo, sarebbe diventato un romanzo un po' più di nicchia, e se non ci fosse stata Rosemary, se non ci fosse Rosemary oggi a custodire la storia, ancora a tramandarla nei luoghi dove è successo e comunque conservano uno spirito in qualche modo delle storie che l'accompagnano, non ce l'avremmo, e sono figure fondamentali, io credo. Questa cosa ha cambiato il presente.
Who comes from the bridal chamber? It is Azrael, the angel of death.
Right, thank you so much. Thank you, David. That was brilliant. Thank you for sharing that video with us. That was fantastic. And thank you to other speakers as well. That last hour and a bit's flown by. I can't believe the time already. So I think what we'll do now is we'll just open up for questions. I did put a little message in the chat there saying if anyone wanted to submit their questions, then they could do. And I see someone did put in a question, but then it got answered by somebody already in the chat. So we do still have a little bit of time. If you have anything at all you want to ask our wonderful panel of speakers, then you have got the time to do that now. I'll give you just a moment to put those in the chat if you'd like to. And please forgive the wailing noise in the background. That's my cat, making it very clear that he is not happy, that he's getting no attention right now. I think you've done such a good job covering this topic that you've left no questions for anybody. You should be very proud of yourselves. Oh, Chloe's come up with a good question. She's asking, I think you could each answer this one if you wanted to. What are your favourite pieces by Walter Scott?
Oh, that's the favourite pieces of music derived from Walter Scott, or just favourite pieces? I think in terms of, yeah. So I think in terms of songs, I think actually some we have in the collection. I'm particularly fond of Jock of Hazeldean. It's a song I learned when I was very young, and so didn't know it was by Scott then. So that's one of my favourites, because I've been singing it for a long, long time. And also Bonnie Dundee, which also features in the exhibition. So, David, you?
Well, there is so much, and it's so varied, and it can talk to so many different moods that it's very difficult to know what at any particular moment is a favourite piece. When it comes to music, however, I have to choose Lucia as the supreme bit of Scott turned into music, in spite of what I've said about simplification and reduction and so on. And it is the most extraordinary opera, and really gets one.
Jane, do you have any thoughts on that? No, how well you.
Not on the music. I have to say that my first reading of Walter Scott was Ivanhoe, and that came through watching. There was a televised series with Anthony Andrews. Susan Curran, my colleague, will say the same thing. We both fell in love with Anthony Andrews and Ivanhoe, and that made us read the book. So. Simplification and a derivative form was how I came to read Walter Scott, and I think Ivanhoe was still. I am fond of a kind of romantic tale, so there we go.
That's great, and I think what we've seen tonight is those adaptations of Scott were often people's way into Scott, so it's very much in that tradition. And also, I think it reiterates something that I've been saying. I wish we could get a good adaptation of a Scott novel for a film or on the telly. That should be our aim for 250, I think.
That's great, thank you so much. We've got another question. The question is, has your work so far on the songs of Scott impacted your readings of the novels?
David, do you have thought on that?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. I didn't appreciate just to what extent Scott belonged to a singing culture. Street entertainment, home entertainment. You went to a dinner and you would have someone who would sing a song and you would provide a chorus for everybody. And I suddenly thought, instead of being a sort of deliberate anthology of different kinds of literature, the novels are actually very much closer to lived life than I ever understood. And that really has been quite a revelation.
Yeah, I think that's true, because one of the things we've also discovered is how often people were reading Scott's works aloud. So we know how many books were sold, but we realised that far more people were actually experiencing them, because there's all these letters saying, we got our copy of Lady of the Lake, and Father, we stayed up far too late because Father was reading it to us. And I don't know, David, I quite like the idea that when they came to the songs, they maybe burst into song. And actually, you I'm sure they did. And you see those songbooks, such as the Austen one, and you think they probably did start singing at those points. Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm. There's a wonderful anecdote about when the king in 1822, he was late, inevitably. And while the people at the Theatre Royal were waiting for him to turn up, they were singing songs from Rob Roy, because they all knew the songs from Rob Roy by that point. So they were actually, while they were waiting for him to turn up, that they just sang the songs in a sort of communal activity.
That's great. Thank you so much. The next question is, so we've gotten so many nice comments and compliments about how amazing this evening's been. It's hard to pick out the questions in between all the love that we're getting in the chat just now. Someone's asking, what is everyone's single favourite exhibit?
Oh, the favourite thing in the exhibition? I don't know, I love all of them. I have a particular fondness for things like the playbills, because they tell you so much about the social context for the time. And as you'll see in the exhibition, you know, you don't only get told that it's going to be Rob Roy, you get told about all the special effects and what else is being performed on the same night and what else is going to be performed next week. And, you know, one of the things I always love about studying Scott and working on Scott is when you can kind of relate it back to the kind of real context of people's lives and how they were experiencing it. And I think the playbills really allow you to do that. Jane, do you have a thought? Because you've looked at everything in the collection, which is great. It's more than David and me probably have. Absolutely everything.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the playbills are fabulous because I don't know, they speak directly to you. They don't seem to be of their time. They're of your time as well. I like that. I do like the original boards of the Waverley novels, Waverley itself. I do like it's just the plain and the modest kind of appearance that they have as well.
Yeah. And I think that surprises people because they expect a first edition to be so fancy.
Yes.
You know, but of course, the fancy bindings that we so often see are people have bound them up like that.
I mean,
so we're so lucky.
Yeah, there are plenty of fancy bindings in the collection. I mean, some beautifully bound books, but I quite like these ones because they're plain and modest and as they were when they were issued.
Yeah. David, do you have any favourites in the exhibition?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to evade the question, but not in an evasive way. Exhibitions of books, just books, can be quite dull because you just see print. And one of the things that is good about this exhibition is just how much varied stuff there is, which illustrates Scott, illustrates his works, and brings alive a cultural context for Scott and his continuing impact in the 19th century. I think it's marvellous.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. I have to take a moment just to read out a couple of really nice comments that we had from a couple of people that have joined us this evening. It was about David's teaching. Yes, Morna and Peter Williams have said, brilliant contribution from David. We were students of his back in the mid-70s and it's wonderful to see him again. And then slightly after that, if I can find the next one, Angela Young also said, another student of David's from the 80s here, and both Scott and David's enthusiasm made a lasting impression. So there you go, David. You've got lots of fans in the audience. Let me see what the next question would be. Oh, Jenny's asking, which of Scott's songs will people still be singing at the Scott 500 celebration?
Oh. Well, David, you're organising a singing event, so what do you think?
Oh, I can't tell, because if anybody's still alive in 250 years' time, they're bound to have different tastes and different intellectual interests, and there are bound to be a different set of problems entirely. And one of the extraordinary things about Scott is the way that he addresses so many intellectual questions that were both relevant at his own time and are still relevant now. There's a book on Scott and environmentalism being published recently, and it's a really important book because of the what Scott says about gardens and about planting woods. Scott on planting woods is just really magnificent, and you would think, apart from the old-fashioned language, you would think it was written for now.
Absolutely, and I think that's what I said. We're always surprised by Scott, and people often ask David and myself, how we can have spent so much of our lives working on Scott, but you're always surprised by something new and a new way of approaching Scott, and I think that's one of the delights of it.
Thank you. You've got somebody here asking if it's possible to produce a second or advanced course on Future Learn, because it was great to learn more about Scott and his music in the previous course. So that's something you can keep in mind for your future projects.
We might have a bit of a rest from Scott 250 first, but yeah.
You might need to. Here's quite an interesting one. Which of Scott's work will be the first on the Broadway stage, do you think?
Ooh. I don't know. Maybe the Bride of Lambermore. I think for the reasons why it is an opera. It has kind of passion and love, interest, and all the rest of it. I suppose you could see that. I don't know. Does anybody have any other thoughts?
Well, actually, the things like Guy Mannering and Rob Roy McGregor are in fact musicals. Had they been written now, we would have called them musicals. I have no idea whether either have appeared on Broadway, but if undoubtedly in the 19th century they were produced in New York, yeah. No question of it. So in a sense, they have been there already. But if one were making a modern musical, there are really quite a number of different novels, depending on what you wanted to achieve. I mean, St. Ronan's Well, for example, if you wanted a tragic stage entertainment, that's something that has never been exploited, and it offers huge possibilities because of the mixture of social satire, again, madness upon stage, and so on. It's a magnificent novel which gives one a quite different kind of imaginative experience when one reads it. It's not like the rest of Scott.
Yeah, and I think, something like Ivanhoe is sneaky. It's probably the one that's been adapted most in the 20th and into the 21st century, but people don't always recognise that what they're watching is something that is very, very loosely based on Ivanhoe. There's a wonderful Australian cartoon version of Ivanhoe, which is really Scooby-Doo. It's got revolving fireplaces and everything, and you can get that on YouTube, and that's sort of magnificent because it's nothing to do with Scott's novel, but you can see that there are connections. There's science fiction adaptations of Ivanhoe. There's all sorts of ways in which it gets, so Scott kind of gets snuck into things. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, you watch that film, if you're a woman of my age, you watch that film and you kind of you kind of think, oh, there's a bit they've pinched from Scott, and there's another bit they've pinched from Scott. So people often say that if Scott was writing now, he'd be writing for film, because he has a real sort of cinematographic eye. Often in Scott, people approach places from high places and look down on them. It's a kind of trick he uses so that he can then describe things. And you can just imagine a camera sort of panning round and, kind of taking in the view and the vista, because Scott's already done that in the writing so often.
That's fantastic, thank you. We've got time for just one more, squeeze it in before past. Someone's saying, I wasn't aware of the link to the currency, and I find that fascinating, as well as the finding of the crown jewels, bringing back much of the culture through George and 1822, as well as the link to Waverley Station. I don't suppose there are any more fascinating nuggets or facts about Scott that wouldn't be so well known.
I am sure there are lots, and I would encourage people to go to Abbotsford and they will find out lots of things about Scott. I think one of the things that people maybe don't know so much is that he went to Orkney and Shetland as well, and that he named places. So Jarlshof in Shetland is sort of Scott's invention, and so that there are, well, the place isn't his invention, but the name's his invention. So there's lots of places all over where you can find Scott's influence. My parents-in-law, who are not Scottish, when I became part of the family, they eventually said things like, so what has Scott got to do with this bit of Scotland? Because everywhere we went, I would say, and Scott said this, or he wrote this, or he did this. So they ended up with the impression that everywhere in Scotland was connected to Scott in some kind of way. I think what people don't appreciate is just how much Scott did for other people. You know, all these writers who write to him saying, here's a poem I've written, and Scott writes back and says, you know, well, good luck to you, you know, but keep up the day job, and here's some money to keep you going, and all these kind of things. And I think Scott's generosity and his compassion is one of the things that probably isn't emphasised enough, to be honest. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything there.
Well, there is a line through Scott which is not very often developed, and that's his work on Scots law. He was not a great lawyer, but he was constantly articulating the need that Scottish law retain its identity in the face of the homogenization tendencies of and the House of Commons, which was frankly ignorant of Scots law. So it's a repeated theme right way through his career that he is articulating the separateness of Scots law and arguing that Scotland needed legislation that was compatible with Scottish law and with the nature, the constitutional status of Scotland.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. I said we've run out of time. I can't believe it's 7:30 already. I would have loved to have had a chance to read out all the amazing comments that we've had, and we've been absolutely inundated. So I think that should tell everyone that was involved tonight how much everyone has really enjoyed themselves. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Ali and Jane and David for lending us their time tonight and their expertise. It's been absolutely fascinating. And to the wider museums and special collections team for working with us to put this together. It's certainly been worthwhile. I think everyone's had a wonderful evening. And a huge thank you to everybody that took the time to attend and interact and get involved this evening. You've made it extra special. So thank you very much for coming. Emma from the museums team did put a link to the exhibition in the chat there, and we'll also include a link to the exhibition in our thank you email that we're going to send out tomorrow, so that you can get a chance to take your time and properly have a good look at it. So thank you again to everyone involved and to everyone for coming, and we hope you enjoyed the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care.